The Ghost Bridge. Chapter 1. The Shortcut. In the quiet outskirts of Barkerville, where the dense forest encroached on winding dirt roads, travelers whispered of a strange bridge that appeared at dusk. Known locally as the Ghost Bridge, it spanned a narrow but fast-moving river deep in the woods. Most dismissed it as a myth, but those who claimed to have seen it described its eerie beauty, ancient wooden planks shimmering faintly in the twilight as if caught between worlds. Thomas Grady, a young prospector, had little patience for ghost stories. After a long day of fruitless digging, he decided to take a shortcut back to town. His usual path was blocked by a fallen tree, forcing him to navigate deeper into the woods. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. That's when he saw it, a bridge stretching across the river, illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. Its design was old but sturdy, its planks worn smooth by time. A sense of unease prickled at the back of Thomas's neck, but exhaustion overrode his caution. "A bridge is a bridge," he muttered, stepping onto the wooden planks. The air grew heavy as Thomas crossed, the sound of rushing water below muffled, as though he were moving through a dream. Halfway across, he noticed the planks beneath his boots seemed oddly translucent, as if the bridge weren't entirely solid. He paused, glancing back, but the forest behind him had faded into a misty haze. The far side of the bridge beckoned with a strange pull, and Thomas pressed on. As he stepped off the last plank, the world shifted. The forest looked the same at first glance, but the air felt thicker, and the light carried an unnatural dimness, as if filtered through a veil. When he turned to look at the bridge, it was gone. Confused but undeterred, Thomas continued toward where Barkerville should have been. The forest seemed endless, the landmarks unfamiliar. After hours of walking, he stumbled upon a clearing with a small cabin. Relieved, he approached, but his knock went unanswered. Peering through the window, he froze. The cabin was fully furnished, but everything was coated in a fine layer of dust. Plates sat on the table, half-eaten meals long decayed. A single chair was overturned, as if the occupants had fled in haste. The forest around the cabin seemed alive, the trees swaying without wind. Faint whispers carried through the air, voices too indistinct to understand. As night fell, Thomas realized he wasn't alone. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, their shapes humanoid but wrong, elongated limbs and hollow eyes that glowed faintly. Thomas decided to leave the clearing, his instincts screaming that the cabin wasn't safe. He stumbled through the dark, the whispers growing louder, forming fragments of sentences. "Turn back. You don't belong here. The bridge is the key." When he finally stopped to catch his breath, he noticed the glowing eyes again, this time closer. One by one, the shadowy figures emerged, their forms flickering like candlelight. They didn't attack, but their presence filled him with a bone-deep dread. "You crossed," one of them rasped, its voice like dry leaves. "The bridge takes what it's owed." "What do you mean?" Thomas demanded, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. "To leave, you must give what you took." Thomas remembered the tales of the Ghost Bridge, stories of travelers who vanished without a trace. He had laughed them off as superstitions, but now he realized the truth. The bridge wasn't a shortcut, it was a gateway. Those who crossed it entered this place, a shadow of the world they knew, and few ever returned. "What did I take?" Thomas asked. The figure reached out a spindly hand, pointing to his chest. "Your time, your place, your life. To return, you must leave part of yourself behind." Desperate to escape, Thomas pleaded for another way. The figures whispered among themselves, their voices overlapping like a haunting chorus. Finally, one stepped forward and offered a deal. The bridge would reappear, but Thomas would never be whole again. A part of him, his memories, his strength, his soul, would remain in this realm. With no other choice, Thomas agreed. The bridge reappeared at dawn, its planks glowing faintly in the pale light. Thomas crossed it, his steps heavy with dread. As he reached the far side, the familiar forest of Barkerville came into view, the mist lifting with the morning sun. But something was wrong. His mind felt fragmented, his memories jumbled. Faces he should have recognized were strangers, and the gold fields that had once driven him now held no meaning. He returned to town a shadow of the man he had been, haunted by the whispers of the bridge. Years later, Thomas's story became another legend whispered among prospectors. He warned others to avoid the ghost bridge, but curiosity and greed always drew them to its cursed planks. None who crossed returned the same, if they returned at all. And deep in the wilderness as dusk falls, the bridge waits, its planks shimmering faintly, luring the lost and the desperate into a world where time and reality dissolve, and the only way back is through sacrifice. The Stranger's Map, Chapter 1. The Drifter. Barkerville was bustling, a town alive with the fever of the gold rush. Miners haggled over supplies, horses clattered along muddy streets, and saloons rang with drunken laughter. Amid the chaos, a shadowy figure appeared. A man dressed in tattered clothes, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. The drifter wandered into a saloon and approached a group of miners seated at a corner table. His voice was raspy, like wind through dry leaves. "Gentlemen, I've got something you might be interested in." From his coat, he produced a weathered parchment. Unfurling it, revealed a detailed map of the surrounding wilderness. Bold red ink marked a spot far from established claims, accompanied by the words, "Riches beyond measure." The miners, weary from months of fruitless digging, leaned in. One of them, a wiry man named Jack Coulter, spoke first. "How much?" The drifter grinned, revealing teeth like yellowed tombstones. "Not gold. I want something more valuable. Your word that you'll tell no one where you got it." The miners exchanged uneasy glances, but agreed. With that, the drifter slid the map across the table, tipped his hat, and disappeared into the night. The next morning, Jack and his three companions, Tom, a burly former trapper, Samuel, a soft-spoken blacksmith, and Eddie, the youngest and most eager, set out. The map's route led them away from the familiar goldfields and deeper into uncharted wilderness. At first, the journey was uneventful. They followed the map's clear instructions, crossing rivers, climbing ridges, and navigating dense forests. Spirits were high as they joked about the riches waiting for them, but on the third day, the map began to change. Eddie, who carried the map, was the first to notice. "This trail wasn't here yesterday," he said, pointing to a new line that had appeared, leading them west instead of north. "Maybe we missed something," Tom grumbled, scratching his beard. Jack took the map, studying it carefully. The ink seemed fresh, as if the lines had just been drawn. "We follow it," he decided. "It's gotten us this far." The terrain grew rougher, the forest denser. Strange carvings appeared on trees, symbols none of them recognized. Nights were filled with eerie sounds, distant whispers, the crack of branches, and the unsettling sensation of being watched. Samuel, usually quiet, voiced their growing unease. "This map, it's not natural." Jack dismissed him. "Riches like this don't come easy." By the fifth day, the group was lost. The map had led them into a dark valley, its towering pines casting perpetual shadow. The air was heavy, carrying the metallic tang of decay. The symbols on the trees were more frequent now, and their shapes seemed to shift when no one was looking. That night, their campfire refused to burn bright. The whispers grew louder, forming words just out of comprehension. Eddie swore he saw figures moving in the darkness, but when he shouted, nothing emerged. In the morning, the map had changed again. The red ink now formed a circle. The words "turn back" scrawled across it. Tom threw the map into the dirt. "It's a trick. That drifter set us up." Jack picked it up, shaking his head. "We've come too far to quit now." Following the map's new direction, they came upon a clearing dominated by a massive stone monolith. Strange markings covered its surface, glowing faintly in the dim light. At its base was a pile of gold nuggets, larger than any they'd ever seen. Elation turned to terror as the ground trembled. From the forest emerged a towering figure, its body a grotesque amalgamation of bark, moss, and stone. Its glowing eyes burned with ancient fury. The miners froze, paralyzed by the creature's presence. It stepped toward them, the earth shaking with each stride. Samuel whispered, "It's a guardian protecting this place." Jack, driven by desperation, grabbed a nugget. The creature roared, the sound reverberating through the valley. The miners scattered, running blindly into the forest. As they fled, the forest seemed to come alive. Trees twisted to block their path, roots rose to trip them, and the whispers became deafening. Eddie fell first, dragged into the darkness by unseen forces. Samuel vanished soon after, his scream abruptly cut short. Jack and Tom, the last survivors, stumbled into a clearing. The map lay there, glowing faintly. Jack picked it up and the ink shifted once more, forming a single word: sacrifice. Tom grabbed the map, his face wild with fear. "It wants us to choose." The creature emerged again, its glowing eyes locking onto them. Jack made his choice. He shoved Tom forward and ran. Jack stumbled back into Barkerville days later, gaunt and haunted. He told no one about the map or what had happened, but the whispers in his mind never stopped. Weeks later, in the same saloon, another group of miners sat at a corner table. A drifter approached them, his face obscured by a wide hat. From his coat, he produced a weathered map. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice raspy, "I've got something you might be interested in." The Invisible Visitor. Chapter 1. The First Footprints. Winter had settled over the Cariboo goldfields with a relentless grip. Snow draped the forest in an oppressive silence, and the miners who hadn't fled to warmer towns hunkered down in their cabins, waiting for spring to return. Samuel Griggs was among the few who stayed, stubbornly clinging to the hope of striking it rich in his isolated claim miles from Richfield. One frigid morning, Samuel awoke to find something peculiar. Outside his cabin, perfectly etched in the snow, were footprints, large, deep, and leading straight to his door. Yet no one had knocked, and there were no tracks leading away. Samuel chalked it up to the wind, reshaping an old trail, and dismissed the unease that settled in his gut. But the next morning, the footprints were back, fresh, unmistakable, and again leading only to his door. By the third day, Samuel couldn't ignore the strange occurrences. The footprints appeared every night, each time closer to the cabin. He bolted his door, double-checked the window latches, and slept with his rifle close. But the footsteps persisted, their pattern unbroken. He tried to follow the tracks, but they vanished just a few paces into the forest, as if the visitor had simply ceased to exist. The snow was undisturbed beyond that point, leaving Samuel more perplexed than ever. When he mentioned it to a passing trapper, the man's face darkened. "You're not the first," he said, his voice low. "Footprints that lead nowhere? It's the unseen one. My grandfather used to tell stories about it, something that walks where it pleases but can't be seen." That night, Samuel stayed awake, determined to catch the intruder. He lit a lantern and sat by the window, his rifle resting on his lap. The hours dragged on, the cabin's walls creaking under the weight of the cold. Sometime after midnight, he heard it, faint crunching in the snow. Heart pounding, he peered out the frosted window but saw nothing. The sound grew louder, as if something heavy was approaching. The footprints formed right before his eyes, depressions appearing in the snow, one after the other, marching toward his door. "Who's there?" Samuel shouted, throwing open the door. The wind howled, carrying only silence in response. The footprints ended at his feet, yet the space before him was empty. He slammed the door shut, his hands shaking. The warmth of the fire did little to dispel the icy dread that crept over him. By the end of the week, the presence outside his cabin seemed bolder. The faint sound of knocking woke him one night, though no one was there. Objects inside the cabin began to move. A chair shifted slightly, his tin cup rolled off the table, and the latch on the window clicked open despite being locked moments before. One morning he found a message scratched into the frost on the window: "Leave." Samuel's determination began to waver. He considered abandoning his claim, but pride and desperation kept him rooted. "I won't be scared off by a ghost," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The turning point came on a moonless night. Samuel was roused from an uneasy sleep by a loud thud against the cabin wall. Grabbing his rifle, he flung the door open and stepped into the cold. This time, the footprints were different, larger, deeper, and spaced farther apart, as if whatever made them was running. They circled the cabin erratically before leading into the forest. Against his better judgment, Samuel followed them, his lantern casting long, flickering shadows on the snow. The tracks led him to a clearing where the trees seemed to lean inward, as if guarding a secret. In the center, the snow was disturbed, churned up as though something massive had been pacing. The air was thick and heavy, carrying an unnatural stillness. A sudden gust extinguished his lantern. In the darkness, Samuel felt it, an oppressive presence pressing down on him, the hairs on his neck standing on end. He turned to flee, but a voice low and guttural stopped him cold. "Leave this place." He didn't look back. Stumbling through the snow, he reached his cabin and began packing his belongings. Whatever was out there wasn't human, and he had no intention of staying to find out more. Samuel reached Richfield the following morning, pale and visibly shaken. He told his story to anyone who would listen, though most dismissed it as the ramblings of a man too long isolated in the wilderness. But a few nodded knowingly. "The land remembers," an old miner said. "Sometimes it doesn't want us here." Samuel never returned to his claim. In the spring, a group of prospectors visited the site, hoping to find his abandoned equipment. They found the cabin intact, but noted something strange. The snow around it was littered with footprints, all leading toward the forest. Among them were fresh tracks, large, deep, and still melting in the sun. To this day, old-timers in the Cariboo tell the tale of the invisible visitor. It's a warning to those who venture too far into the wilderness. Some paths are meant to remain untrodden, and some doors are better left unopened. The Hanging Tree of Barkerville. In the bustling gold rush town of Barkerville, where fortunes rose and fell as swiftly as the Fraser River flowed, one towering pine stood at the center of the square. Its twisted branches loomed like skeletal arms, casting shadows over the muddy streets. To the miners, traders, and townsfolk, it was known simply as the Hanging Tree. The tree bore a grim legacy. In the lawless days of Barkerville's infancy, justice was swift and often cruel. Accusations of theft, murder, or treachery rarely saw the inside of a courtroom. Instead, verdicts were declared by mobs and sentences were carried out beneath the pine's gnarled branches. Its bark bore deep grooves from countless nooses, each a mark of another life extinguished. Over time, rumors spread that the Hanging Tree was cursed. Locals swore they could hear faint cries on windless nights, pleas for mercy and whispered prayers. Lanterns placed near the tree flickered out without explanation, and shadows beneath it seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally, defying the light. Among the most chilling tales was that of Jacob Hensley, a gambler accused of cheating and murdering a rival during a drunken brawl. Dragged to the tree by an angry mob, Hensley maintained his innocence to the end. As the noose tightened around his neck, he bellowed a final ominous curse. "Mark my words, you'll all hang for this." Hensley's words seemed to take root in the town's collective conscience. In the months that followed, the men who had condemned him met untimely and mysterious ends. One fell into a mine shaft, another drowned in the icy Fraser River, and a third vanished into the wilderness, leaving only his bloodied coat behind. The tree became a symbol of fear, avoided by those who believed it carried the weight of the dead. Years later, Evelyn Carr, a travelling spiritualist, arrived in Barkerville. Renowned for her seances and uncanny connection to the spirit world, Evelyn quickly drew the attention of the town. Upon learning of the Hanging Tree, she insisted on investigating its dark history. "This place is not just haunted," she declared, standing in its shadow. "It's ravenous." Evelyn proposed a séance to commune with the restless spirits, warning that their anguish fed the tree and would eventually consume the town itself. Despite their fear, the townsfolk's curiosity outweighed their apprehension. On a still, moonlit night, a crowd gathered around the hanging tree as Evelyn pressed her hands against its rough bark. Her voice rose in a rhythmic chant, and the air grew heavy with an unnatural chill. Whispers emerged from the darkness, faint at first, but swelling into a mournful chorus. Evelyn's eyes flew open, her voice shaking as she proclaimed, "They are trapped. Their suffering binds them here. If the tree stands, their pain will fester. Release them, or Barkerville will never be free." Evelyn's revelation divided the town. Some demanded the tree be cut down to free the spirits, while others feared destroying it would unleash something far worse. Days turned to weeks, and the debate dragged on, leaving the hanging tree untouched. One stormy night, nature intervened. A jagged bolt of lightning struck the tree, splitting it in two. Its massive trunk crashed to the ground, sending splinters flying and a resounding crack echoing through the valley. In the days that followed, the town seemed transformed. The chilling whispers ceased, shadows lay still, and the air grew lighter, as though a long-held burden had been lifted. The remains of the hanging tree were buried outside the town, hidden from curious eyes. But rumors persisted that its roots still clawed deep into the earth, holding on to the last echoes of the lives it claimed. Today, Barkerville stands as a preserved monument to the Cariboo Gold Rush. Visitors gather in the square, where guides recount the haunting tales of Jacob Hensley, Evelyn Carr, and the Hanging Tree. Some claim the spot where the tree once stood still carries a subtle chill, a lingering trace of its dark past, and on certain quiet nights when the wind stirs just so, a faint voice can be heard, justice or vengeance. The Forgotten Trail. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Path. Nestled deep in the Cariboo wilderness was the Forgotten Trail, a narrow path that had guided prospectors and traders for decades. It connected Barkerville to a network of lesser-known mining claims and settlements, winding through dense forests and across babbling creeks. Though rugged, it was reliable, until it wasn't. On an unremarkable autumn morning, Samuel Harlow, a courier carrying vital supplies, set out from Barkerville along the trail. The air was crisp, the leaves golden, and the trail well marked as always. But hours later, when Samuel turned to retrace his steps, the trail was gone. In its place was an unbroken sea of towering pines and tangled underbrush. His cries for help echoed unanswered. By evening, Samuel stumbled into Barkerville, disheveled and shaking. "The trail vanished," he stammered. "It's not there anymore." The townsfolk dismissed his account as the result of exhaustion or drink, until others came forward with similar stories. Travelers reported walking the trail only to find themselves circling back to the same spot or emerging miles from where they intended. Fear crept through the community as rumors of a cursed forest spread. Determined to solve the mystery, a group of 5, led by veteran trapper Elias Cross, set out to map the trail. Among them were Margaret Wynne, a sharp-tongued schoolteacher eager for adventure, and Jonathan Blake, a skeptical surveyor armed with tools to debunk the supernatural claims. The first day was uneventful. The group moved swiftly, marking trees with chalk and driving stakes into the ground to prevent getting lost. They camped near a creek, laughing at their ease in navigating the supposedly cursed trail. But as dawn broke, their laughter faded. The markers were gone. The stakes had vanished. Even the creek had shifted, flowing in the opposite direction. "Impossible," Jonathan muttered, consulting his compass. The needle spun wildly. As the group pressed on, the forest grew darker, the trees denser. Time seemed to stretch and warp. They walked for hours without finding a clearing or recognizable landmark. Whispers danced on the wind, too faint to decipher, yet unnervingly persistent. At midday, Margaret screamed. The others found her staring at a tree etched with her initials she had carved on a tree hours earlier. "We're walking in circles," she whispered. Elias took charge, urging the group to stick together and ration their supplies. But unease spread like wildfire. Jonathan insisted on logical explanations, but his voice quavered with doubt. Margaret muttered prayers under her breath, clutching a small pendant. As night fell, the group made camp, setting watches. Elias stayed awake, his rifle across his lap. Around midnight he saw it, a faint light weaving through the trees, too deliberate to be fireflies. He woke the others, but the light vanished as they scrambled to look. "The forest is playing tricks on us," Elias said grimly, "but we won't let it win." The next day, the whispers grew louder, almost intelligible. The forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Trees creaked, though there was no wind, and shadows shifted in unnatural ways. The group stumbled upon a clearing filled with rusted tools, broken lanterns, and scraps of fabric, remnants of past travellers. Margaret found a journal among the debris. Its pages detailed another group's journey along the trail years ago. The final entry read, "The forest watches. It remembers. We are part of it now." Panic set in. Jonathan attempted to climb a tree to get a better view, but the branches seemed to twist and break beneath his weight. He fell hard, spraining his ankle. Elias carried him, though the strain was visible on his face. The group pushed forward, desperate for escape. That night they heard heavy footsteps circling their camp and saw glowing eyes peering from the darkness. Whatever watched them stayed just out of reach, but its presence was undeniable. On the fourth day, the group's morale shattered. Supplies were running low, and Margaret refused to move, insisting the forest wanted them to stay. "It's showing us the way," she murmured, pointing to a directionless void. Elias, fed up, grabbed her arm. "The forest is lying." As he spoke, the ground beneath them shifted. Roots burst from the soil, ensnaring Jonathan's legs. The group frantically hacked at the roots until they released him, but not without leaving deep, bleeding gashes. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, words finally clear. "Stay with us." That night, Elias devised a plan. "We follow the creek. Water leads to civilization." Though the creek twisted unnaturally, they followed it. The whispers faded but never disappeared. The forest seemed to fight their progress, with fallen trees blocking their path and sudden mists obscuring their vision. After what felt like days, they broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a logging road. The forest fell silent behind them, its oppressive presence lifting as if retreating into itself. Margaret collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Jonathan, pale and shaken, whispered, "We were never meant to leave." The group returned to Barkerville, their story met with disbelief and awe. The trail remained impassable, its legend growing with each retelling. Elias left the town soon after, haunted by dreams of glowing eyes and shifting trees. Margaret became reclusive, refusing to speak of the forest. Jonathan, despite his injuries, published a detailed account, though he left out the whispers and eyes, afraid no one would believe him. Years later, travelers continued to vanish in the area, their belongings sometimes found near the clearing. Locals avoided the forest, whispering of the forgotten trail and the voices that called to those who ventured too far. And deep within the Cariboo wilderness, the forest watched, waiting for its next visitors. The Gambler's Stagecoach. In 1864, at the height of the Cariboo Gold Rush, the rugged trails of British Columbia swarmed with fortune seekers, weary travelers and opportunists, desperate to strike it rich. Among them was Elias Hart, a gambler whose silver tongue and uncanny luck were as legendary as the gold he won and lost. Elias wasn't just a card player, he was a master of reading faces, sensing desperation and exploiting it for his gain. On the outskirts of the Fraser River, in a smoky saloon lit by flickering lanterns, Elias faced his highest stakes game yet. Around the table sat miners, merchants and landowners, their fortunes dwindling with every deal. As the final hand came down to Elias and a grizzled prospector, the room grew silent. With a sly grin, Elias laid down his cards. A royal flush. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the prospector slumped in defeat. Sweeping his winnings into a satchel, Elias rose. "Gentlemen," he said, tipping his hat, "it's been a pleasure." As he turned to leave, an old man with a weathered face gripped his arm. "Gold shines bright, but it casts a dark shadow," the man muttered. Elias chuckled, brushing off the warning as superstitious nonsense. The next morning, Elias boarded a stagecoach bound for Barkerville, a booming town promising new opportunities to turn his fortune into an empire. The coach was worn and creaky, its driver a gaunt, silent man named Harlan Graves. With a grin that sent a chill down Elias's spine, Harlan gestured for him to climb aboard. Inside, Elias joined 3 passengers: Margaret Bell, a widow clutching a locket, Jonas Frisk, a jittery prospector eyeing Elias's satchel, and Reverend Amos, a stern figure clutching a worn Bible. The journey began with an uneasy stillness, broken only by the coach's groaning wheels and Harlan's eerie low humming. At a rest stop, Elias noticed strange carvings on the stagecoach's wooden panels, ancient symbols etched deep into the grain. When he asked about them, Harlan's grin widened. "Keeps the bad spirits away," he said cryptically. As the journey continued, the atmosphere grew oppressive. Fog clung to the ground like a living thing. Margaret whispered about sins catching up. Jonas grew more agitated, while the Reverend's prayers took on a frantic tone. The once light satchel on Elias's lap now felt heavier with every mile. By nightfall, tensions boiled over around the campfire. Jonas accused Elias of cheating, claiming the gold was cursed. Margaret revealed her journey's purpose, visiting her husband's grave, a man who died penniless in his hunt for gold. The Reverend warned that no man could carry so much sin without retribution. Harlan sat silently, his grin ever present. When Elias demanded answers, Harlan finally spoke. "I already know how this ends." That night, Elias dreamed of shadowy figures clawing at his satchel, their whispers echoing in his mind, "Give it back." The next morning, the trail transformed into a twisting, otherworldly path shrouded in fog. Margaret wept openly. Jonas muttered incoherently. Even the Reverend fell silent. When Elias checked his satchel, he found the gold had turned black, its shine extinguished. Desperate, Elias ordered the coach to stop, but Harlan ignored him. Panicking, Elias flung open the door, only to find a swirling void beyond, filled with the anguished cries of the damned. The passengers revealed their true forms, phantoms with hollow eyes and spectral hands. "Join us," they whispered, voices like rustling leaves. At last, the coach stopped in a desolate graveyard. Harlan grinned, tipping his hat. End of the line. The satchel grew unbearably heavy, dragging Elias to his knees. As ghostly hands reached for him, his screams echoed through the misty graveyard. Harlan climbed back onto the coach, his eerie tune resuming. "Plenty of room for more," he said, disappearing into the fog. Epilogue. To this day, tales persist of a haunted stagecoach that roams the old Cariboo trails on foggy nights. Its passengers are said to be those who paid the ultimate price for their greed, while its driver hums a tune that chills the soul. Travelers who see it are wise to steer clear, for its next stop may be theirs. Echoes of the Rush. Of Barkerville's small museum, history seemed to breathe through relics of the Cariboo Gold Rush. Pickaxes dulled by time, hand-drawn maps with faded ink, and sepia-toned photographs of miners with weathered faces told stories of fortune and folly. Among these artifacts rested a silver pocket watch, its casing adorned with intricate swirling patterns. A placard beneath the watch read, "Found at the site of an unsolved 1864 murder. Owner unknown." Dr. Eleanor Graves, a historian specializing in the Gold Rush era, wandered the museum on an autumn afternoon. She was searching for inspiration for her next book when the pocket watch caught her eye. "What's its story?" Eleanor asked the curator, Mr. Halverson, a spry man with a passion for the past. "It's a mystery," Halverson replied. "The watch was found at the scene of a murder over a century ago, never solved. They say it stopped ticking the moment its owner died." Intrigued, Eleanor asked to examine it. Halverson unlocked the case and placed the watch in her gloved hands. As she traced its engravings, a peculiar sensation enveloped her, like a low hum vibrating through her very being. Before she could react, the museum dissolved around her, replaced by a bustling street filled with the sounds of hammering, laughter, and the creak of wagon wheels. Eleanor blinked, disoriented. She stood on a dirt road lined with wooden storefronts and crowded with people dressed in 19th century attire. A sign above a nearby building read, "Barkerville General Store, 1864. Her heart raced as she realized the impossible. She was in the past. The pocket watch, still in her hand, ticked loudly. She opened it and noticed an inscription she hadn't seen before. "To James, may time always favour you." "Lost, miss?" a voice interrupted her thoughts. Turning, she saw a miner with dirt-streaked hands and a kind smile. "Yes," she stammered. "I just arrived." "Name's Thomas Cooper," the man said, tipping his hat. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Eleanor replied, forcing a smile. As Eleanor acclimated to 1864 Barkerville, she pieced together the events leading to the murder linked to the watch. The victim, James Barclay, was a charismatic but ruthless prospector. Eleanor observed him in the saloon, where he exuded confidence and drew both admiration and animosity. During her eavesdropping, she witnessed a heated argument between James and Eli Tanner, a miner accusing him of claim theft. "You'll pay for this, Barclay!" Eli shouted. "If you have proof, take it to the magistrate," James retorted smugly. Eleanor's stomach churned. She knew she was witnessing the prelude to James's murder. The following morning, James's body was discovered behind the saloon. His watch was missing, and a bloody knife lay nearby. Sheriff Albert Grayson suspected Eli Tanner, given his public threats. Eleanor, desperate to solve the mystery and return to her time, examined the scene. She noticed peculiar details. The knife bore no fingerprints, and James's belongings were untouched, except for the missing watch. She approached Sheriff Grayson. Eli Tanner's threats were too obvious. Someone's framing him. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think so?" Whoever took the watch knew its value and wanted to hide something more valuable, the truth. Through careful observation and questioning, Eleanor uncovered the real killer. Victor Hale, James's business partner. Victor had been embezzling gold from their shared claim and feared James would discover his betrayal. The argument with Eli Tanner provided the perfect cover. Confronting Victor in the saloon, Eleanor presented the evidence. His face drained of color and he tried to flee, but Sheriff Grayson apprehended him. The pocket watch was recovered from Victor's belongings, its steady ticking marking the end of the mystery. As the town buzzed with news of the solved murder, Eleanor felt the pocket watch hum once more. The world around her blurred and she found herself back in the museum, the watch now silent in its case. "You all right, Dr. Graves?" Harbison asked, his concern evident. Eleanor smiled, though her heart still raced. "I think I've just uncovered the perfect story." Epilogue. Walking out into the crisp Barkerville air, Eleanor carried the weight of a century-old secret. The whispers of 1864 lingered in her mind, an era of greed, ambition, and the mysterious pull of time itself. And among the glass cases of the museum, the pocket watch remained, its story waiting for those willing to hear the echoes of the rush. The Lantern Keeper. Nestled in the shadow of the Cariboo Mountains, Quesnel Forks was once a bustling hub during the gold rush, where the Quesnel and Cariboo rivers converged. Over time, the lively town faded into a quiet ghost town, its streets overtaken by nature and its wooden buildings leaning with the weight of history. But according to whispers from locals and occasional visitors, Quesnel Forks was never truly abandoned. On certain nights, a spectral figure is said to wander its hills, carrying a lantern that casts an unearthly glow, guiding lost souls through the wilderness. The story of the Lantern Keeper begins in the mid-1800s, during the height of the Cariboo Gold Rush. Among the prospectors and settlers was Elias Hart, a kind but solitary man who served as the town's lamplighter. Each evening, Elias would move through the streets, lighting the oil lamps that lined the town, his presence a quiet reassurance. Elias's life was marked by a deep sense of duty, a trait that proved fatal one fateful winter night. A sudden snowstorm struck the region, stranding a group of miners in the hills. Despite warnings of the storm's ferocity, Elias took up his lantern and ventured out to search for them. Days later, his frozen body was discovered in a snowdrift, his lantern extinguished. The miners he sought were never found. Not long after Elias's death, strange tales began to surface. Travellers passing through Quenil Forks on dark, moonless nights described seeing a faint light weaving through the hills. Some swore it was the flicker of a miner's lantern. Others claimed it glowed with a ghostly hue, but all agreed it moved with intent as if searching. One account came from a prospector named Henry Tabor. Arriving in Quenil Forks late one night, he told of losing his way in the surrounding wilderness. Just as fear began to overtake him, he spotted a lantern's glow in the distance. I followed it, he said, and it led me straight to the edge of town. But when I turned to thank whoever carried it, there was no one there. Over the years, locals began to believe Elias's spirit had returned, bound by a need to guide the lost and protect those in peril. It was said that his appearances coincided with storms or moments of danger, his lantern's glow a warning or a lifeline. A travelling preacher, Reverend Jonathan Crane, claimed to have encountered the lantern keeper during a fierce storm. Stranded on a remote trail when his horse threw a shoe, the preacher saw a soft, glowing light ahead. It led him to an abandoned cabin where, inexplicably, a lantern burned brightly inside. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the Reverend proclaimed, though the locals credited Elias for his salvation. By the 1930s, Quenil Forks was nearly forgotten, its once thriving streets now silent. Still, the legend of the lantern keeper endured. That summer, a team of surveyors set up camp near the town to map the surrounding area. Among them was Alice Munro, a no-nonsense skeptic who dismissed the tales as fanciful exaggerations. One evening, while exploring alone, Alice wandered too far and became disoriented as night fell. Panic set in as she realized she couldn't find her way back. Just as fear threatened to overwhelm her, a warm glow appeared in the distance. At first, Alice assumed it was one of her colleagues searching for her. But as she approached, she realized the lantern floated without anyone holding it. Hesitant yet desperate, she followed the light, which guided her through the dense forest and back to camp. Pale and shaken, Alice recounted the event. "I don't believe in ghosts, but that light saved my life." To this day, stories of the lantern keeper persist. Hikers and campers in the area report glimpsing a flickering light on stormy nights, often followed by the faint creak of a lantern swinging in the wind. Those who follow it speak of finding safety, while others claim to hear footsteps in the dark, though no one is ever there. Elias Hart's sacrifice lives on in the hills he once roamed. Whether driven by duty or redemption, the lantern keeper's glow remains a beacon for those who lose their way, a quiet reminder of a man whose light never truly went out. The Watcher's Warning. The small mountain town of Ash Hollow, nestled in the shadow of Pine Ridge, was known for its quiet charm and hard-working residents. The ridge loomed high above the town, offering a bird's-eye view of every street, field, and flickering lantern. Few ventured up there, for the solitary figure who lived at its peak was as much a mystery as the mountain itself. The hermit was known simply as the Watcher. Tall and gaunt, with a wild mane of hair and eyes that seemed to pierce through you, he was often seen standing at the edge of the ridge, gazing down at Ash Hollow. His presence was unsettling, but over the years the townsfolk had grown used to him. That was until his warnings began. The first warning came in the spring. The Watcher descended from his ridge, his tattered cloak flapping in the wind as he marched into town. He banged on the doors of the general store, the saloon, and the church, his voice rough but insistent. "A storm is coming," he declared. "Tie down your roofs and move your livestock to higher ground." At first, the townsfolk laughed him off, but the next day a freak storm swept through Ash Hollow, tearing apart barns and drowning fields. The Watcher's prediction was the talk of the town, but no one dared ask how he knew. Throughout the year, the Watcher's warnings continued. He foretold a mine collapse, saving the lives of dozens who evacuated in time. He predicted a wildfire that skirted the town, urging them to dig trenches and soak the earth. Each time his warnings were eerily precise, yet the townsfolk grew wary. Some whispered that he was cursed, others that he brought the disasters with him. "A man like that," said the blacksmith, "ain't natural. Best to leave him be." The Watcher, for his part, never stayed after delivering his warnings. Once his message was given, he returned to his ridge, where he could be seen pacing back and forth, always watching. One autumn evening, the Watcher appeared again, his silhouette stark against the setting sun. His face was pale, and his voice cracked with urgency as he cried out in the town square, "Leave Ash Hollow. Tonight, the fire will come. Take only what you can carry and go." This time, the townsfolk did not listen. They had grown weary of his dire proclamations, and no one wanted to abandon their homes on the word of a madman. The mayor confronted him, his tone firm. "You've done enough, old man," he said. "We're staying put. Take your warnings back to the ridge." The Watcher's eyes filled with despair. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I've seen it, over and over." The mayor waved him off, and the Watcher retreated, his figure dissolving into the shadows of the ridge. That night, as the town slept under a cold, clear sky, the air seemed to thrum with an unnatural stillness. Just after midnight, flames erupted in the heart of Ash Hollow, consuming buildings with a ferocity no one had seen before. The fire spread impossibly fast, leaping from house to house as if guided by unseen hands. The townsfolk fled, their screams echoing through the night. Some made it to the river, others to the forest's edge, but many were trapped, their homes collapsing in fiery ruin. From his ridge, the Watcher stood motionless, his face illuminated by the inferno below. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks, but he did not move. In the days that followed, survivors combed through the ashes, finding little more than charred rubble. The Watcher's ridge loomed above them, but he was nowhere to be seen. Curious and desperate for answers, the mayor led a group up the ridge to the hermit's shack. Inside, they found it abandoned, its walls covered in old, brittle newspapers. One headline caught their eye: "Founder of Ash Hollow dies in tragic fire." The article detailed how William Hale, the town's founder, had perished decades earlier in a mysterious blaze that destroyed the original settlement. The mayor's hand trembled as he picked up a cracked mirror lying on the table. In its reflection, he caught a glimpse of the Watcher standing behind him, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. When he spun around, the figure was gone. The endless cycle. The survivors rebuilt Ash Hollow, but the ridge remained untouched, a grim reminder of the fire. Some claimed they still saw the Watcher at dusk, pacing the ridge, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. Now they understood his warnings. William Hale, bound by guilt and tragedy, was doomed to watch his town burn again and again, forever trying to save it from a fate already written in flames. The man who never slept. The gold rush town of Van Winkle thrived in the shadows of the Cariboo Mountains, its muddy streets bustling with hopeful miners and opportunists. Among the chaos, a man arrived one chilly spring morning. His name was Gabriel Kane, a tall, wiry figure with piercing eyes and a perpetual air of calm. Gabriel's arrival was unremarkable at first, just another prospector looking to strike it rich. He rented a small room at the only inn, bought supplies at the general store, and took up work on an abandoned claim. What stood out, however, was his work ethic. Gabriel never stopped. While others retreated to the saloons or their beds at dusk, Gabriel was seen digging by lantern light, his shadow stretching long against the hills. "Hard worker, that one," the innkeeper remarked one morning. "Didn't hear him come back last night." "He's like a machine," another miner said. "Never takes a break." The town took notice. Gabriel's stamina was the subject of awe and whispers. As weeks passed, stories emerged. Gabriel was never seen eating or sleeping, and his claim seemed cursed with an eerie silence. No birds sang, and even the wind seemed to avoid the area. Some chalked it up to his intense focus, while others felt an unsettling twinge in their guts when they spoke his name. The first accident was small. A miner named Jed slipped and broke his arm near Gabriel's claim. He swore he felt a presence watching him, though no one was around. Then, livestock began disappearing from the town's outskirts. The butcher, a gruff man named Harland, claimed to see a shadow darting through his pens at night, moving faster than any human could. Soon, more ominous events followed. A group of prospectors who ventured near Gabriel's claim reported strange noises, low, guttural hums that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Another miner vanished entirely, his tools abandoned and his campsite eerily undisturbed. The only clue was a faint set of footprints leading toward Gabriel's claim, but they stopped abruptly, as if the miner had been lifted into the air. The townsfolk began to watch Gabriel more closely. By now, he had become a source of both fascination and dread. Each evening, as lanterns flickered out across Van Winkle, his solitary light burned on the hill. Sheriff Eli Granger decided to confront Gabriel. Leading a small group of men, he approached the claim at sunset. Gabriel was there, as always, driving his pickaxe into the rocky ground. "Evening, Kane," Granger called. "Mind if we have a word?" Gabriel paused, straightening to his full height. His eyes, sharp and penetrating, seemed to glow faintly in the fading light. "Of course, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" Granger hesitated, unnerved by Gabriel's unwavering gaze. "People are worried. Strange things have been happening. Livestock gone, folks disappearing. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Gabriel's lips curled into a faint smile. "Strange things often follow those who dig too deep, Sheriff. You might say the earth has its secrets." The cryptic response chilled the men to their bones, but without evidence, Granger could do nothing. They left, vowing to keep a closer eye on Gabriel. One fateful night, the townsfolk were jolted awake by an unearthly sound, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Those brave enough to look outside saw Gabriel's claim bathed in an otherworldly light, the ground trembling beneath their feet. A group of armed men, led by Sheriff Granger, rushed to the scene. As they approached, the light faded, leaving only Gabriel standing in the center of his claim, his pickaxe planted firmly in the ground. "What have you done?" Granger demanded, his voice trembling. Gabriel turned to them, his face devoid of emotion. "The time has come," he said simply. Before their eyes, Gabriel's form began to change. His skin took on a metallic sheen, his eyes glowing like molten gold. "I was sent to observe, to wait," he said, his voice now resonating with an inhuman timbre. "Your kind's greed has awakened what lies beneath. I am merely the herald." The ground beneath them split open with a deafening roar. From the fissure emerged tendrils of glowing, pulsating light, an ancient force awakened by the miners' relentless digging. Gabriel, now fully transformed into a gleaming alien figure, stepped into the light and vanished. The aftermath. By dawn, the claim was gone, swallowed by the earth. The townsfolk fled Van Winkle, abandoning their dreams of gold for fear of what lay beneath. Those who survived spoke in hushed tones of the man who never slept and the price of unbridled greed. Years later, the story of Gabriel Kane became legend, a warning of the dangers of disturbing what should remain buried. And on quiet nights, travelers passing near the abandoned town claimed to see a faint light on the hill, a solitary figure still watching, waiting. The trial of Raven Hill. Raven Hill was a settlement shrouded in mist and whispers, perched precariously on the edge of the wild caribou forest. Its name came from the black birds that perched ominously on the towering pine trees, watching the miners toil. Life was hard but steady until the miners uncovered the book. It was found deep within a cave, hidden behind a crumbled stone wall. Bound in cracked, blackened leather, the tome seemed ancient beyond reckoning. Its pages were filled with cryptic symbols, strange incantations, and the name Morgana scrawled repeatedly. The miners were intrigued and frightened, but one among them, a man named Reeve, saw potential. The symbols appear. Shortly after the book was unearthed, strange things began to happen. Symbols, identical to those in the book, appeared carved into trees, etched into walls, and even scratched into miners' tools. Livestock grew sick, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. The superstitious townsfolk whispered about Morgana, the witch whose name was woven throughout the tome. Legend had it that Morgana was a powerful sorceress who once ruled over the forest, striking fear into anyone who crossed her. Centuries ago, she was betrayed and burned by villagers who feared her growing power. The book, it was said, contained spells to summon her spirit and bind her to the summoner's will, for a price. When a miner's body was discovered near the cave, his face frozen in a rictus of terror, the whispers turned to outright fear. Someone, they believed, was summoning Morgana. The accusation. The tension in Ravenhill reached a breaking point when the symbols began appearing closer to the settlement. A scapegoat was inevitable, and the reclusive herbalist Eliza became the target of suspicion. She lived alone at the edge of town, providing remedies and poultices, but rarely joining the community. "She knows the old ways," muttered one miner. "She's always out in the woods. Who's to say she hasn't been calling the witch?" Eliza's protests fell on deaf ears. A town meeting was called, and the miners, whipped into a frenzy, declared that she must be tried for witchcraft. Her fate was sealed when Reeves stepped forward, claiming he had seen her near the cave on the day the book was discovered. The trial. The trial was a farce. Eliza pleaded her innocence, her voice breaking as she swore she had nothing to do with the symbols or the strange occurrences. She begged them to consider who among them might truly be responsible. But the crowd, fueled by fear and superstition, was unmoved. They built a pyre in the center of town, its wood piled high and doused with oil. Eliza was dragged to the stake, her hands bound, her face streaked with tears. The flames and the revelation. As the fire roared to life, Eliza cried out, "You'll regret this. The real evil isn't me. It's among you." From the back of the crowd, Reeves smirked. The book was hidden in his cabin, its spells having guided him to rich veins of gold. He thought himself clever, using the town's fear to divert attention. He leaned closer, eager to see the spectacle. But the fire did not consume Eliza. As the flames licked at her body, they turned an unnatural green and twisted into a spiraling column of smoke. The crowd gasped as the smoke condensed, forming the figure of a woman. Her eyes glowed like embers, her voice a chilling whisper that carried through the night. "Morgana," she said, her gaze falling on Reeve. The crowd recoiled as Morgana stepped out of the flames, her presence radiating power and fury. Reeve's smirk vanished as she raised a hand, pulling him forward with an invisible force. "You dared to summon me," Morgana hissed, "without tribute, without respect." The witch's vengeance. Chaos erupted as Morgana unleashed her wrath. Flames leapt from the pyre, consuming homes and turning the night into a hellscape. The earth trembled, swallowing the town's mine. Ravens descended in a black swarm, their cries deafening. Reeves' screams were the loudest of all as Morgana dragged him into the air, his body writhing before he vanished in a burst of smoke. The townsfolk scattered, their fear now mingled with guilt. Morgana spared only one, Eliza, who stood unharmed at the center of the inferno. The witch turned to her, her expression softening. "You have suffered unjustly," Morgana said. "Your soul is untainted. Go, leave this place." Eliza, trembling but resolute, nodded and fled into the forest as the town crumbled behind her. The Legacy of Ravenhill. By dawn, Ravenhill was nothing but ashes. Eliza disappeared into the wilderness, her fate unknown. Those who survived told of the witch's wrath and the warning she left behind. Greed and betrayal will always be punished. Years later, travelers passing through the area reported seeing green flames flickering in the distance and hearing whispers on the wind. Some claimed to see a woman standing on the ridge, her eyes glowing like embers, forever watching over the ruins of Ravenhill.